Before we get started, I have to give a gigantic thanks to the people that back this project on Patreon. You have quite literally made this retrospective possible, and I honestly can't thank all of you enough for that. If you want to be a part of this amazing crew, click on the link in the corner of the video or check out patreon.com/Avalanche Reviews. Well guys, we have officially made it to the series' most contentious entry. After Resident Evil 5, Capcom knew they had to come out swinging, and that is exactly what they did. With a bigger budget, a bigger scope, and a larger dev team, this game had enough force behind it to make sure this would be the RE game to end all RE games, and little did we know that is precisely what it would do, but maybe not in the way anyone expected. So why not come experience the end of what I like to call Resident Evil's action horror period? A cautionary tale regarding the dangers of excess and trying to please everyone. What's up guys, I'm Jared from Avalanche Reviews, welcoming you to part 6 of the Resident Evil Retrospective. After RE5 sold more copies than any other Capcom game, it was clear that we were going to be stuck with the third-person over-the-shoulder style for a long time coming. For fans of 4's drastic departure from Resident Evil norms, this was great news, but for those of us who were wishing for a return to slow-paced, atmospheric survival horror, well, things weren't too good. Or were they? See, a combination of conflicting reports kept the entire fan base on an emotional roller coaster. At first, the news that Eiichiro Sasaki would be heading up development was a godsend, as he was the brains behind the criminally underrated Outbreak games. Then more good news came when screenshots of Leon fighting more traditional zombies hit the internet. But not long after that, we started hearing that Capcom felt RE had outgrown the survival horror genre and that RE6 would be an action game. At this point, fans like myself got a little vindication when the minds behind the series agreed that they were no longer making survival horror games, despite the legions of RE4 fans screaming otherwise. Not long after this, gamers got a playable demo that cleared up a lot of things, but made for some pretty bad press too. First and foremost, we were finally able to confirm that yes, zombies were indeed a part of Resident Evil again. Well, kind of. We now knew that the game would be made up of several interweaving stories, and one of those stories would revolve around the series staple, an outbreak of the undead in a major city. Sadly, this proved to be the exception and not the rule, but hey, beggars can't be choosers, right? Oh, and don't you worry, we'll definitely be diving deeper into this topic later in the video. Sadly, instead of creating more hype for what was already an understandably hyped up development process, RE6's demo raised some very real warning signs. It seemed like the consoles at the time just weren't ready for this new revision of Capcom's MT framework, as both platforms showed heavy amounts of screen tearing and huge dips in frame rate. Needless to say, we weren't exactly 100% on board, but aside from this and a small theft leading to a few copies being sold in Poland before their release date, this has been the least dramatic development of any game covered in the retrospective so far, which has got to count for something. Before we get started on 6's story, I want to point out that this is a follow-up to a series of reviews covering the RE franchise, and I'll definitely be glossing over points that I've made in previous videos. If you want the full context of my views on modern Resident Evil, click on the card in the corner to check those out first. Okay? Okay. The story in RE6 is a surprisingly satisfying affair, and much like Part 5, strives to feel more like something you would have gotten out of the earlier games if those games had an unlimited budget and writers influenced by huge Hollywood blockbusters. The basic idea is, well, actually kinda hard to explain. See, RE6 has you experience the story from the perspective of Leon, Chris, Ada, and Jake. So while there's an overall narrative to explore, most of the attraction here is the personal side stories of the many characters. These branching paths often connect with each other in the typical RE fashion, and I think this game handles this approach better than any game in the series. Each individual story might share locations and plot points with the rest, but for the most part they're all fairly unique, and after interacting with one of the other characters, I always felt compelled to start their campaign up just to see what brought them to that point. Okay, so let's jump into a very brief overview of what we're dealing with here. Leon's story has to do with the outbreak of a newly discovered C virus and how it involves the president's decision to go public with some nasty secrets. This was the most Resident Evil feeling story in the game, but to be honest, it kinda drags ass in the middle. Of course, there is a lot to be said about a new RE story that actually includes zombies in it, so keep that in mind. Chris is still a card-carrying member of the BSAA and is currently recovering from the loss of nearly his whole team to the leader of what's being called Neo Umbrella. His campaign deals with revenge and a globe-trotting attempt at preventing another deadly C-virus attack. Jake is a mercenary fighting on behalf of Neo Umbrella until he's approached by an all-grown-up Sherry Birkin who's looking to bring Jake back to the US so his natural immunity to the C-virus can be turned into a vaccine. To be honest, I didn't think I was gonna like Jake's story at first, as he's the new guy of the bunch, but there's a few revelations that sticks him pretty damn close to the previous canon. And even though I thought the idea of Sherry joining a government task force was a little cheap, I actually ended up getting into her and Jake's dynamic.
Jake!
The last campaign is more of a tying up of loose ends experience from Ada Wong's point of view. It answers a lot of contradictions found in the other three stories, but to be honest, it's kind of skippable. Which is good since it used to only be accessible once all other campaigns were finished. Ever since Capcom started taking flack for their on-disc DLC practices, Ada's campaign has been made available right off the bat, but if you're gonna check it out, I would definitely save it for last, as there are a few minor spoilers in it. Okay, so we have 4 stories essentially all happening on top of each other. The obvious question is, does the sum of their whole feel like a disjointed mess? And I have to say, it definitely doesn't. Each story has its own unique feel and sparingly recycled events or locations, which helped entice me to pick up the next campaign right after I finished the last. Overall, I'd definitely recommend Leon's story as the must-play, but all of them were surprisingly enjoyable. Even though it would have been easy to emulate 4's idea of throwing out almost all the established lore and focusing on unrelated matters, RE6 fully embraced its lineage. Constant references are made to past events, characters seem true to their original roles, and the fan service is kept to a respectable level. On that note, who noticed that Leon's still using his VP-70 from Part 2? That's pretty damn cool. Of course, this comes with the obvious criticism of feeling like an attempt at pleasing everyone, and I can honestly say, that's exactly what's going on here. Those of you just wanting to experience a singular narrative with your favorite character might come away a little disappointed, but if these stories were fun enough to rope me into finishing all of them, I gotta assume you might like them too. Plus, there's the added bonus of being the longest Resident Evil game in history. Each story is about an 8-hour ordeal, so if you're interested, be prepared to lose a bit of your free time. Now, I do want you guys to keep in mind all of this praise I'm throwing out comes with one gigantic asterisk. I am a fan of the older Resident Evil games, and I 100% prefer them to the post-survival horror entries. For me, Resident Evil 2 was the absolute pinnacle of RE storytelling, but if you're gonna play a newer entry in the series, I can confidently say this is it. Yes, it's obviously unashamed in its pure balls-to-the-wall ridiculousness, and yes, at one point a bad guy turns into a huge fly monster, which you then proceed to harness the power of a lightning storm to kill, but you really have to respect a game that can look you dead in the face while it has characters jumping motorcycles into helicopters without even cracking a smile. Like I said before, no one was surprised by RE6 sticking with the over-the-shoulder third-person gameplay popularized in 4. What did surprise people was the fact that we could finally shoot and move at the same fucking time. A feat that would be pretty impressive if the Outbreak games wouldn't have already achieved it damn near a decade beforehand. But not so innovative innovations aside, the gameplay in 6 is relatively unchanged from what you would expect from a combination of parts 4 and 5, but with some great additions under the surface. As you can see, shooting remains largely unchanged. Hitting L1 will aim your weapon, and now that movement is possible while aiming, the left and right analog sticks move your body and gun respectively. Being able to back up while laying down some cover fire is a huge addition, but the real fun comes in when you figure out that hitting the action button while shooting will perform a dodge roll. Now, in any other instance, this wouldn't even be worth mentioning, but after a dodge roll, continuing to hold L allows you to shoot from the ground all while crawling around and rolling Max Payne 3 style. This was a crazy fun mechanic to play with, and it added a cool level of strategy. Oftentimes I would make my way through an area but restart it with the aim of making a more stylish run. which left me with some kick-ass results like this. These second or sometimes eighth attempts reminded me of doing the same exact thing with spectacle fighters like Devil May Cry 3, and the absolute best part about this feature is the fact that you could play through the entire game and never really need it. I can appreciate the level of attention the devs put into a part of the game that is in no way necessary to use, but is just about the most fun addition to an RE game I've seen in a very long time. Other than some supremely satisfying combat, there's also a little bit of light cover-based shooting, which is a little less mandatory than you might think. Instead of grabbing gold to buy weapons and upgrades from a shop, 6 has you collecting points to redeem on skills. This was kind of a cool idea, but to be honest, I never felt a large enough difference between having them and not having them. With the exception of one skill that actively made the game better by allowing your partner to heal you when they pick you up off the ground, which is a great way to segue to the fact that each and every campaign is played with a co-op partner. There are options for both online and local co-op, and just like my review of 5, I'll say that this has never really been a selling point for me. I know a lot of you guys seem to really get a kick out of playing these games multiplayer, but I don't know, it just never clicks for me. Each of the 4 main characters has their own quirks, which means you probably won't be relying on the same strategy each playthrough. Leon's more Resident Evil feeling experience feels like if RE4 took place inside RE2. As the only campaign with honest-to-goodness zombies in it, there's a bit of a slower pace and the focus is more on atmosphere and scares. Chris is more shooting heavy, which means an added emphasis on finding cover and keeping your distance. Jake has a boatload of melee options, but to be honest, I was never really able to make much use of his combos, which was a missed opportunity since his gameplay style got me pretty excited at first. I ended up having a lot of fun with Ada since her focus was more on stealth, and there's just something satisfying about doing this. The Quicktime Events have made a triumphant return, and like I keep saying over and over again, I really wish there were a better way to do this without cluttering up my screen with button cues. However, I will say the sound that plays when you complete one of these is oddly satisfying. They do seem to be way more numerous this time around, but this didn't piss me off the same way it did reviewers at the time. At first, I judged 6 pretty harshly for allowing focus testing to break it into what is essentially 4 separate games, but after putting more than 50 hours into this bad boy, I have to say it's easily one of the most fun games in the modern series for me. Even as I write this, I'll start a quick game at a random chapter and try to finish it in as stylish a way as possible. The controls are spot on, the shooting is satisfying, and what should feel like a mishmash of conflicting playstyles is actually really engaging. The over-the-top Hollywood action movie scenarios kept me away from 6 for a really long time, and I agreed with a large portion of the fan base who shunned it based on the demo alone. The only problem is now that I played it, I fucking love it. Now I'm in the awkward position of having to defend the most hated game in the series, and I really don't have much else to say other than it is an absolute blast. The hokey action set pieces, the giant explosions and hulking bioweapons, they all come together to form the only logical endpoint for a style of gameplay created by a guy who was bored to death with survival horror. It's not just a big dumb action game with a small portion dedicated to horror, it's an insanely fun big dumb action game with a small portion dedicated to horror. Are the old RE games much more enthralling experiences? In my opinion, yes, but like I've said about a million times, we are no longer dealing with real RE games. Playing through 4, 5, and 6 in order has been really fucking fun, but the fact remains they fall about as far from classic Resident Evil as humanly possible. Not to wear out an old phrase, but Part 6 is an incredibly fun game, it's just not a Resident Evil game, so take that for what it's worth. Resident Evil 6 is a really odd game as far as graphics go, mostly because every step up from its predecessor is followed by an immediate step down somewhere else. Using MT Framework's latest revision, you would expect 6 to far outperform RE5, which it does, but only in certain odd situations. A perfect example is how incredible the game's big city levels look. Every neon sign and blood-smeared piece of asphalt looks incredibly believable, and an eye for an environment design really drives home the feeling that these were busy streets just a short time ago. Inversely, smaller, differently textured environments like caves and small graveyards look simple and poorly defined. The wet look that made the city streets look like they came right out of a horror movie just doesn't translate well to these areas. For example, the effect they were going for by having water run down this church comes off fake looking and really amateur, but once we get inside, things go back to looking incredible. This is a hard one to call because it's entirely possible the area is underperforming for me, may be the result of poor design and not a lack of graphical wizardry, and the more I look back at my footage, the more this seems to be the case. Character models are a very clear upgrade from those found in 5, but it seems to be only in the realm of geometry. Call me crazy, but I think textures were a little more complicated in Part 5. One thing I absolutely did like was how detailed the enemies were. Zombies in Leon's campaign ranged from looking like everyday people who just happened to have recently died, to rotting corpses with jawbones missing. The Plagas-type Chuavo that are found in everyone else's campaigns look like they got an equal amount of attention, and all seem to have an insect theme to them when they transform, which leads to this absolute terror of a half-human, half-spider. With the upside of some really gorgeous looking character models comes the odd downside of facial animations being pretty hit or miss. Sometimes they look great, even surpassing the really good looking animations found in 5, but there's also times when they look pretty bad, even messing up simple lip syncing. I also found a weird experience where cutscenes would sometimes take on a very choppy frame rate. I can't really explain this, as even my aging GTX 770 is more than enough to run this game at max settings with a firm 60 frames per second. The change is subtle but definitely noticeable, and if you have an eye for that, it'll probably annoy the hell out of you. After a bit of research, I found that a recent update essentially destroyed performance on older machines, so I guess I'm lucky it never happened during gameplay. After all this complaining, there is one part of the game I can compliment 100% of the time, and that's the giant emphasis on post-processing effects. I didn't know this engine was capable of making little things like slight motion blur, specular lighting, and particle effects look this beautiful. Seeing the Chuavo disintegrate into sparkling ash never fails to impress, and extremely bright lights interact with the environment in a very convincing way. I find that a lot of what makes me appreciate a game's graphics tends to lie in the small details like this. I also really enjoy seeing parts of a zombie fly off while I'm shooting them, and actual bullet wounds appearing. Ever since the original Far Cry, it's been hard to find a game that gets those little things right. And this seems like a perfect time to analyze 6's ports, which will be a fairly easy endeavor since there weren't too many to speak of. The original release hit the 360 and PS3 first, and to be honest, it wasn't exactly a looker. Textures were muddy, the resolution was locked in at 720p, and the frame rate jumps below 30 frames per second pretty often. There's also the issue of some slight screen tearing, but an early patch made this much less of an issue. Needless to say, I would not recommend the original release if you're going to play 6 today. 1 year later, we got a PC port that still remains one of the best ways to experience the game. It's surprisingly well optimized, despite some later patches, and of course allows you to far exceed the console's measly 720p. It also comes with a fairly respectable assortment of graphical options. Chief among these is the ability to control your field of view, an option I really would have loved to have seen included in 4 and 5's PC ports. With a bit of digging through these graphics options, I also found out I had the ability to get rid of the on-screen heads-up display. After I found out about this, I could never go back to seeing this huge bastard on screen all the time. Of course, there's the obligatory anti-aliasing solutions, but FXAA is the only option here. I opted to play without AA since this style of fast approximate anti-aliasing tends to not only smooth edges, but also the entire screen. Don't get me wrong, it's nice not seeing jaggies, but not at the loss of overall sharpness. 3 years after the PC port came the current gen console remasters. These releases kept the 1080p 60 frames per second output of the PC version, and other than a few options being removed, are essentially the same exact experience. You can find both console and PC releases for under $20 nowadays, and since they're so similar, it makes recommending one over the other pretty hard. The good news is, no matter what your situation is, there's an objectively good port of RE6 for you to play. And if it hasn't been clear so far, I would absolutely recommend you play this game. I know what all the reviewers have said, and to be honest, they're mostly right. This is a dumb action game that isn't even a shadow of its survival horror predecessors, but as far as dumb action games go, it's damn near one of the best. Fans of the old games might want to pick it up for Leon's campaign alone. Sure, it's not the classic Resident Evil experience, but it can be very atmospheric, and it's nice seeing a zombie outbreak in an RE game again. If you like 5, you'll likely already be on board with the gameplay here, and if you liked 4 but find 6 unplayable, I'd ask you to lift your nostalgia blinders just a bit, because 6 is everything 4 tried to be, but better. The over-the-top action sequences, the emphasis on adrenaline-pumping fast pace, the third-person shooter gameplay, it's all here but vastly improved and far more enjoyable. In fact, I went back to play 4 after getting this footage, and I can honestly say it was an objectively worse experience. Look, what I'm trying to say is this is the only direction the series could have possibly gone after the absolute tsunami of praise that we as a whole showered Part 4 with. Capcom could only give us more, and I find it kind of amusing that we all hated them so much for it when they did. Just so I'm being very clear here, I'm not trying to insult you if you don't like 6, but maybe take a hard look at the fact that you may have paved the way for it. 4 was a great action game, but we all treated it like the second coming of video games, and the only option from there was more. And when 5 came out, it was clear the ante had to be upped again. And now that we're here, I think it's time to take a little responsibility for what we helped create. As a whole, I can sum up my experience with parts 4, 5, and 6 as an action-packed blast. Each one was legitimately fun, and they kept improving as they progressed. They obviously can't hold a candle to the original games as far as atmosphere, horror, and overall satisfaction is concerned, but like I've said a few times already, I'm not here to condemn the post-survival horror games. I came into this with the intent of being objective and shedding my obvious bias, and I hope I've done exactly that because we have officially come to the end of this era in the series. As you guys already know, the next numbered RE game would be another huge departure from the established norm, but instead of jumping right in, I think it's time to give one of the more unknown titles its 5 minutes of fame. Could I be finally talking about branching off into the many spin-offs this franchise has to offer? Well, I hope to answer exactly that next time on the Resident Evil Retrospective.
Wish I believed God were looking out for us right now, but I think we're on our own.
Hey guys, thanks for swinging by. I've been enjoying the hell out of producing this series, and interacting with you guys has made it more than worth the effort. If you get into retrospectives like this, check out the playlist on screen, and if you like what you see, maybe check out my Patreon page to help keep this channel alive and kicking. Well, thanks guys, I'll see you next time.